Hello, welcome. This is my name is Kenneth Arnold. I am the art curator for the Dezikes cases at Cowell College. Tonight, we bring you a very wonderful conversation between myself and Dr. Nolan Higdon. Dr. Nolan Higdon is the author of The Anatomy of Fake News and co-host of the Along the Lines podcast. He teaches in the education department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His areas of concentration include youth culture, news media, history, and critical media literacy. Today, we'll be discussing the pervasive issue of fake news in American media today. And Nolan, I want to thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. This is a cool opportunity. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. So let's just jump right into it. Nolan, I want to ask you, what is the difference between the term fake news when it's used by politicians, such as the 45th president, and the term when it's used by academics?
Yeah, well, this is the central reason that I ended up writing the book. Donald Trump had began using the term to denounce any journalism that he found problematic for his interests. So if it was something that he disagreed with or he didn't want to be true, he called it fake news. And for a long time, prior to that, I had been studying the phenomenon of fake news, and I kind of saw an opportunity that for once, so many people were talking about fake news, that this could be a good opportunity to discuss it. But I went back and looked at the academic literature, and there wasn't a lot of consensus, and there still really isn't, on what fake news is. Some people think that it's only propaganda. Some only talk about it in the digital age. Some only talk about it coming from governments, particularly foreign governments. Some are only fixated on like right-wing fake news. And so what I did in the book, and what I did in the book was I tried to explain that fake news is a much more longstanding problem, and if we're going to address it, we need to have a comprehensive understanding of fake news. And so I define fake news as any false or misleading content that is presented as legitimate journalism or news. And with that broad definition, that gives us a better understanding of the potential content that's out there that is fake news.
Were there any politicians before Donald Trump who utilized maybe not necessarily the exact phrasing fake news, but similar strategies in creating misinformation or putting down their critics?
Yeah, this was one of the things I really emphasized in my book, was that there was a long history of using different powerful institutions and organizations, whether it be government or corporations, to try and censor or quell certain ideas under the auspices that you were battling fake news or false information. You can go back to like Presidents Jefferson and Adams. They were paying journalists to write fake news stories about each other and then using the federal government to silence those journalists. You can look back at like the Red Scare of 1919 or the Cold War, where the supposed threat of communist fake news was used to legitimize the government going in after like progressive groups under the auspices that they were reporting fake news. So unfortunately, we do have a long history of using fake news as a like Trojan horse to go after progressive groups and other ones who are challenging power structures.
Wow, that's interesting. I did not know that this kind of phenomenon goes back so far in our history. It's the conception even of our country. That's pretty crazy. I want to follow up with this question, asking you in a modern context today, what are the ways in which fake news is spread? How do people get fake news?
It really, with the exception of the internet, which I realize is a big exception, fake news hasn't really changed. It's always gone through print or word of mouth or broadcast or auditory. So it continues to be disseminated amongst those and other media. But the internet is one of the big differences, because now fake news can reach many more people quite faster than it used to be able to in human history. And due to some of the structures, like social media structures, the way they're designed, they actually privilege false content over fact-based content. This is because their economic model is based on getting users to react, and users usually react to things that are divisive or that spread hate, and those are the exact type of themes you find in fake news. And study after study illustrates that false content is more likely to spread online than true content. But there's a caveat there that I always like to point out, that that's not because like the internet as an invention privileges fake news. It's because of the companies, the way they develop their platforms is a way that they privilege fake news. So this isn't a question of like, is the internet bad? This is a question of how the economic models of these companies affect the distribution of information.
And what are some of the ways in which these fake news stories are harmful, to society or individuals?
Yeah, I mean, there's many ways. One is that democracies are predicated on people participating and being guided by the information they have. So if the information they have is fake, people may vote against their interests, or they may support politicians who they oppose, or they may stay silent because they think someone is doing something that's good for them when in fact it's not. So you can really manipulate the democratic process. But to me, the most dangerous aspect of fake news is that it can make otherwise good people do horrible or horrendous things that they feel like legitimate or empowered to do. So to give you an example, there's the famous story of Pizzagate, where a father, read online that the Democratic Party was covering up a pedophilia ring and at this pizza restaurant in DC, and he drove from North Carolina to the pizza restaurant and he shot it up. And all the headlines were about like how this guy is such an idiot, and these people believe fake news and all this. But underneath the headlines, what I found most interesting was that the gentleman had only gotten the internet in the home a couple months earlier. So just for a minute, pretend the story is true, which it absolutely is not. And I'm not trying to say we should entertain the idea it's true, but pretend it's true. He would be a hero. This guy went up and liberated, children, right, from this pedophilia ring in that context. And so to me, that's the power of fake news. This father of two, went and did this very brave task if it was true, but based on totally false information. Instead, like terrorize people with a gun in a pizza restaurant. And so I think that's kind of the danger that fake news poses, not just purely by its existence, but by the way that we're constantly and repeatedly inundated with fake content. So we start to have a media ecosystem around us that reinforces these false beliefs, because we as the user in online media spaces, and even watching television, we choose which media we want to see, and algorithms and companies give us the media we think we want, not necessarily the media we need. And studies show this radicalizes people to the point that they start to believe absolute false content, even when facts are readily available to them.
Wow, that is absolutely terrifying. And like you said, I just want to highlight the fact that this was someone who had just got the internet. This isn't like years and years of exposure to false information. It was, at most months, which I feel like kind of shows how fast it can act, right? In this particular situation. But I want to ask you more so specifically in policy, how does fake news affect, like government function?
Well, I mean, it's worth noting here that our government, like all governments around the world, produce and distribute fake news. The United States government has done this domestically. You can go back to like Operation Mockingbird during the Cold War, or even the War on Terror reports that came out of like even the New York Times, where the military and intelligence community were working with domestic news media outlets to produce false or misleading content. And then, of course, they've done it overseas for years. They've used false content to foment rebellions and revolutions in places like Guatemala and Iran and Venezuela, et cetera. So when we talk about the United States government, we have to talk about fake news producers in that sense. Now, as far as the way it shapes governmental policy, Politicians generally are shapeshifters. They react to what the public wants. That is, if the public can put pressure on them, they'll adopt, at least rhetorically, what the public believes. And you see this particularly with, well, actually, you see this with both parties right now, in the sense that, like, the Republicans, they recognize that Donald Trump really resonated with a lot of voters. And so they've sort of accepted a lot of his things, like stop the steal and some of the QAnon deep state nonsense, not because they believe it necessarily, but because it was good. It helped them win, right? The only real danger it posed to them was the storming of the Capitol. But there's a case to be made that this also happens on the left side of the political spectrum as well. I mean, you can look at the Democratic Party. They totally drank the Kool-Aid on RussiaGate, to the point that they were doing these, meaningless investigations, and they still pepper this idea that Russia is behind, the 2016 election outcome, and that, that they're continuously investigating, using Russia as a pretext to investigate, like, progressive groups and progressive campaigns and things like that. So it really affects where our national conversation is at, because most people, again, the studies show, don't really care about Russia, and they really don't care about QAnon, in that sense. But since the voters have it, like, on their mind, and they're talking about it, politicians are talking about it, and it operates as a distraction from things like livable wage, for example, and other stuff like that.
I want to follow up because I'm curious to who exactly is writing fake news, both outside and inside the government. You mentioned earlier that spreading propaganda throughout different countries. I'm curious, like, do we know of specific individuals, groups that are focused on spreading such false information?
From our own government or from other ones?
From our own.
From our own government. Oh yeah. The church committee hearings in the 1970s released, the work of groups like the Central Intelligence Agency, and the State Department, and things like this were working to create false information that was put into the public sphere. A lot of times this work, though, is done with private industry. This is why the debate about where public ends and private begins is pretty obfuscated, because it wasn't like the CIA was publishing newspapers. In fact, they were working with actual publishers to put fake news into news outlets, just like the State Department was working with television companies to script programming. And then more recently, during the War on Terror, I mean, they've been, quite open about it. Like, the majority of guests on, especially like broadcast television news, are either members who have served in political administrations or campaigns, or have or are actively working in the intelligence or military community. And this was the big reveal in 2008, which was that the people on screen often say they're retired, but the report from the New York Times showed that actually they're still employed by the State Department intelligence community, out there shaping public opinion about a lot of these issues. So we know to that degree. Internationally, we know this stuff as well. It's sort of the same boat. There's different agencies in countries. Like the Russians had, like, Operation Infection, which was working with the KGB, for example. But these countries overseas also work with private companies. Like, China has worked very closely with a lot of social media companies to shape information online, including Facebook and others. So they're not too different in that way.
Gotcha. I'm also curious if, in terms of the specifics of fake news itself, is overtly lying about something, or about an event, basically saying A is B, right? Is that the only way in which media outlets and these, I guess you could call it propaganda arms, obfuscate information?
Sometimes it can be a factual lie. Sometimes it can be just simply misleading, in that sense. So it doesn't have to be necessarily that it's not true, but perhaps it's not telling, like, the entire story. So you can cherry pick one kind of event out of context and use it as a precursor to draw a conclusion, when in fact there's counter evidence out there. So those types of things. So, to go back to, like, the Russia example for a moment, there's clear evidence that Russia and elements from the country of Russia were creating false content that was put online during the 2016 election. That's not debatable. How much of it had to do with the election is very little. The fact that the majority of it came out after the election is worth noting, and the fact that no independent study has ever found that it affected the election outcome is important. Furthermore, it's also important to note that a lot of the stories that came out later were debunked by the very sources that were given to support them, like the P tape, the bounty on U.S. soldiers, the shutting down of the Vermont power plant, the infiltration of the Bernie Sanders campaign. All of those things ended up being false afterward. So when you create Russiagate as like a black and white issue where it's either all true or all false, that would be an example of kind of fake news, right? Because just because the Russians did do some things during the election does not mean that they affect the election outcome, nor does it mean all the rest of the disproven nonsense is true. So those are the kind of distinctions you have to get into in fake news. And like similarly, I could make the same argument about like the QAnon conspiracy, right? The QAnon conspiracy says there's like this deep state of actors who remain in government regardless of who's elected, and they really control the levers of power. Well, there are people that fit that description, and that is pretty true. Now, when you jump from that though and say that there's this person Q who's going to expose it, and that these people are um, fixing electoral outcomes, and that Donald Trump is like this grand savior who's going to expose the big thing, now that's total nonsense. So that's how you take these real sort of things or concepts, and then you exploit them, or you create decontextualize them. Then all of a sudden we have fake news.
Would the analogy making mountains out of molehills be apt to describe what you just put down?
Absolutely. That can be that can lead to one of the themes of fake news I find in my book, which is you can create these moral panics. So you essentially find one or two examples of something, and then you over cover it and you treat it like it's happening everywhere and normalize it, and then people freak out. One of the famous examples of this that's covered in a recent like Netflix documentary was like the Black mothers who were giving birth to children who were addicted to crack. There may have been like one example of this, but it was treated like it was a pandemic. And there was this moral panic about these Black women who are addicted to crack and having children addicted to crack. But there's simply no empirical data to back it up. But if you looked at like the magazines and news stories and broadcast news at the time, it was everywhere. It was something we needed to be focused on and freak out about. So that would be an example of making a mountain out of a molehill.
I see. That makes sense. I can see how that can be transcribed into more political and government stories. So I kind of want to move from the specifics of fake news to now, how can people, individuals such as myself, begin to critically engage with the media?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize the media for what they are. In the United States, there's a First Amendment protection for the press, and the idea being that the press is supposed to give us the information we need to make decisions in our democracy. And so when you take that sort of frame of looking at what constitutes news media in this country, you recognize that you don't need a lot of it. Like, I don't need Donald Trump's Twitter feed to figure out how I'm going to put food on my table. I don't need like virtue signaling from like Democrats to figure out like what's best for my community. So you can throw out a lot of media for that if it doesn't serve your sort of community or your needs. I think that's one thing you can do initially. Second, you should always look at like who's treated as newsworthy. There is a very wealthy, well-connected expert class that is it becomes a central focus of most news media in this country, and they don't share the lived experience of the majority of Americans. So I try to cut that stuff out of my media diet, in the sense that they're not going to help me realize anything I need to know. Similarly, you should always kind of look at like the funding models behind corporation or behind news media as well. If it's like corporate funded, each of those corporations have interests, and that affects how they report. I mean, we saw this in like 2020 with like the Washington Post, right? Jeff Bezos and Amazon owned the Post. They really wanted to frame their reporting toward like the Joe Biden wing of the party versus like the Warren or Sanders wing. And they try to shape the primary in that sense, and definitely were anti-Trump to say the least. So looking at like the funding models, there's also like government funded news. So they have a government bias like Voice of America here in the United States. And then there's independent foundations, progressive and conservative, who have progressive and conservative alliances. So understanding those interests, it doesn't mean they're necessarily fake, but you should understand which interests they're serving in the production of knowledge. So those are some of the ways you can interact with news. And also constantly reminding yourself that news is not supposed to be like some trivial fun thing you share online or you read the headlines. News is supposed to inform you and make you a better informed citizen. And if you're simply reading like headlines and just sharing stuff without analyzing it or investigating it, then you very well may be part of the fake news problem.
I see. I wanted to ask you about what you mentioned, that the expert class. I was wondering if you could go into that a little bit in terms of who are these experts, and are like, in my mind when I think of these, I think of when on NBC or what have you, the mainstream media, when they say we're now bringing on expert so and so to talk about this and this. Is that kind of what you mean by that?
Kind of, but I mean like the whole, not the whole, I should say, but the majority of like corporate media kind of parade themselves as experts. And the reason for this is, for anybody who's ever worked in television, one of the things they teach you when you're on broadcast television or whatever is how to sound like an expert, even though you're not an expert, because audiences show that people, tend to turn the channel if it's someone who's inarticulate or difficult to hear or whatever, right? So a lot of folks on television are well trained how to sound like experts, and this distracts us from the content of what they're saying. We conflate, them looking attractive and brightly lit and sounding articulate with actually knowing what they're talking about. And so, sometimes, you have these people in corporate media who give what sounds like expert opinion, but you look at the individual and you ask, like, where do you sort of like, why should you be trusted as an expert in that? Like all these sort of journalists who act like political experts, they come up with these like baseless concepts like electability, right? Like, we got to figure out in the primary who's electable. Well, what does that mean? Like, how do you know someone's electable before they're elected? Right? And in those sort of or they talk about like the voters, like the Black vote or the Latinx vote, as if like talking about a giant portion of people as a monolith is somehow like intellectual. So those are the kind of things I mean by like the faux expertise. And then sometimes people conflate like their own personal interests with expertise, right? So for example, after this GameStop debacle with the folks on Reddit, we saw a lot of people in news media commenting on this, but they tended to be from like with Wall Street and the hedge fund class. And they were talking about how this was a horrible crime and this threatens the market. I mean, really, if you step back, what these folks did on Reddit was exactly what hedge funds do all the time. They manipulated the market for their own ends, right? This is the only time like history where like a working class group actually won. Usually they're always on the losing end. So it was framed by these people who were on the losing end of this one investment as a giant crime that needs to be fixed. Those aren't experts. Those are people out there who are trying to shape public opinion for their own interests. And so I think those are the kind of distinctions I ask people to make when they're looking at press narratives. And in addition to class, which we've talked about here a lot, there's not a lot of working class or poor class people who are represented in news media. The same is true for people of color or ethnic minorities. They're almost never represented in news media as well. Their communities are almost never represented in news media. And when it is personalities who do fit those identity groups, they tend to be from the wealthy class. So these are elites who've gone to elite institutions and schools and been a part of campaigns. And so they have the same ideology as the rest of the people in media. So there's not really like a lot of depth of perspective in that type of media.
I see. So it's almost like they're trying to limit the frame in which what certain topics or stories could be discussed in, right? With like the like, the GameStop example, not even being able to consider it as, hey, maybe it actually is, a victory for the little guy, being pushed through the media. Instead, it's, hey, this is wrong because the elite said so.
Yeah, and it's a good opportunity for journalism. If you're a real journalist, I mean, GameStop exposed what all working people have always known, which is that Wall Street is a fixed game. It's not some organic, like market-driven, objective process. That it's manipulated by those who have money and power, and these folks demonstrated that on Reddit. So as a journalist, that would be a great opportunity to expose that, right? To expose how bankrupt this whole script has been about the market. But instead, they reflect the people that are their sources, the folks they're familiar with from the same like elite institutions, and the public gets this homogenized and pasteurized version of the story that makes them believe that the wealthy and the powerful are somehow the victims.
I see. Now, with all of this kind of gatekeeping of information, so to say, right? What are some alternatives, alternative sources people can use from mainstream news media?
Yeah, so there's a lot of like independent folks out there who do like independent journalistic outlets where you can go to. Common Dreams does a great job of like collating left-leaning stuff. The Intercept does some good like more left-leaning investigative reporting. On the right, you've got things like the Federalist and stuff like that. They'll send out some people. The Wall Street Journal on the right as well. But what I encourage folks generally to do, rather than follow news outlets, because Fox is kind of the one who created this faux narrative, right? Fox taught people like, trust us, we're fair and balanced. Don't trust news outlets. Trust journalists. Find individual journalists who continuously do great work, even if it goes against the conventional wisdom of the elite class. So, these are folks like Brianna Joy Gray or Matt Taibbi, Aaron Mate. These type of folks will continuously report what they find, even if it's unpopular, because they let the facts speak first. When you find folks who do that, I encourage you to go and do that type of reporting. There is a lot of really cool stuff being done in like the podcasting space. That I'm currently working on a project right now on that. There's shows like Rising, which I find very intriguing. You've got a populist right-leaning host and a populist left-leaning host, and they look at the news from a populist perspective of where they overlap. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's more valuable, but it's just something you simply would never get in traditional legacy media. And so I think turning to those kind of sources are interesting. But I do have to say, despite all the hope in podcasting and websites and YouTube shows, that there's been a major crackdown on the internet that people have largely supported because they, rightly oppose, white supremacist ideology and stop the steal nonsense and, other aspects of like Trumpism. But the sort of the power that was given to tech companies to remove that content has been also used to remove the very content that I think people need to be looking for on like more progressive or populist circles, like Rising and podcasts and even like academic conferences which challenge media power have been censored online. And so we're kind of at a critical moment where there's a lot of sources I could turn you to, but you have to hunt them out yourselves, because Google's going to try and suppress them and YouTube will. And so the game is changing a lot as we speak.
Wow, that is to think about it as like trying to find people you can trust, right, in a sea of people who want to mislead you. That it's pretty intimidating. But I was curious in that sense, like, do you have maybe, I know you just said don't trust media outlets, but maybe particular resources, places that kind of maybe collect the names or, kind of share like stories by, truthful journalists, good journalists, good in the sense, they do journalism, or anything like that, or even just fact checking too.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I have to say that I try and really not give lists, and here's why. It's not because I'm lazy, but I try not to give lists because There's something like really McCarthyite about the list idea. And I've seen a lot of corporations and governments try and do this, right? Here's legitimate news outlets. Here's ones you can't trust. And I'm highly critical of that because, like I said, governments as well as corporations produce and benefit from fake news. So they have a vested interest in telling you who to believe and who not to believe. Um, and so I try and stay away from that. My whole thing is that if you really want to solve the fake news problem, you don't get there by lists, you don't get there by censorship, you don't get there by punishing people. You get there by educating people how to discern fact from fiction on their own. You teach people to be critically literate in media. That is how to analyze media and figure out what's true, what's false, what's baseless, what has facts behind it. And so in that sense, there are fact-checking websites you can use, but I would highly emphasize, underline that you only use them as a starting point. You do not just believe them. So things like PolitiFact and Snopes and Media Matters and Fair.org, they do a lot of great investigative work into media. And if you're trying to investigate a certain story for legitimacy, you can go there to see what they've concluded, and then they'll show you what evidence they have to back up that conclusion. Now, that could mean that that evidence is not sufficient enough, et cetera, but at least it's laid out right there for you. And that's a starting point for you to investigate further. Now, I know a lot of people are probably saying, like, dude, if we're just to listen to news or check out the news every day, how are we supposed to investigate? I think it's worth reminding people that democracy is a 24-hour-a-day job. That if you want to have someone make lists for you and tell you what's true and what's false, you should join an authoritarian regime. They're always looking for new members. Hop on board. They'd love to exploit you. But in a democracy, it's up to you to constantly inform yourself, constantly find information. And those First Amendment guarantees of the press are supposed to be one way to guarantee that you have the ability to do that. So I encourage people to spend more time with less content. That is, rather than virtue signal how many headlines you can share in a day, spend a lot of time with like 2 or 3 journalistic piece of content, and dig in deep to what sources they have, what they're claiming, what their evidence is, so you can get a better understanding of the world. And I think that's the way we kind of pull ourselves out of the fake news problem. Because like you said, we have people trying to find fact in this giant sea of information. But what's missing from that sort of analysis is we do not train people in the process of how to think. That is the process of how you determine if something is true, which is different than teaching people what to think, which is here's the list of what's true, here's the list of what's false. And so that's kind of the distinction I would make there with using those sites.
Thank you. Quality over quantity, right? In the sense of what stories you're consuming and the depth in which an individual ought to go in. You kind of answered my last question, but I do want to kind of pull it apart a little bit in terms of specifics. Like when you say educate people, right? I assume you mean in schools and classrooms and higher education institutions. But what might these curriculums look like? And are there ways for people to kind of educate others, in the sense that it's like, someone helping their family or friends or anything like that? What do these kind of educational solutions look like to you?
Yeah, they can happen in a formal setting in schools. They can happen in higher ed. There's community education. There's parent educators. Some of the great work at the Critical Media Literacy Project at University of Southern California. They do some great like community parental work. So it can happen all over, but essentially, I mean, at its most basic sense is to get people to question content. So, who is the publisher? Is it the Washington Post or is it Breitbart? And then investigate that publisher. What interests do they have? Do they have a history of producing false content? Then look at the journalist. Like, who is the journalist who wrote it? Are they actually a journalist? Are they like a blogger? Are they a reporter? Are they a critic? Are they an op-ed writer? What's their history? What's their vested interest? Then look at the news story. What are the sources? Are there enough sources? Are these sources, authoritative on the topic? Are these sources transparent? That is, do we know who they are so we can find them and ask follow-up questions? Or are they like, anonymous, which is really dangerous? And then, who's treated as newsworthy? That is to say, who's missing? Where are, like what we talked about earlier, where are like the communities of color and where are working people? Where are their perspectives in these stories? How come they're not treated as newsworthy? How come these communities are ignored in the majority of news stories? So getting people to kind of fundamentally ask these questions when they sit down with content, and that may mean that we still disagree on everything, but at least we agree on what the facts are. And that's really what democracy is predicated on, is we're allowed to disagree on what we should do about the facts or what the facts mean. But a dangerous spot is when we disagree on what the facts are. And so the education process is just getting us to a place where we can at least agree on what the facts are. And then, as Mark Twain says, we can distort them at our leisure.
Nolan, I want to thank you for being here tonight and answering my questions. And I'm sure that you've helped clear up the fake news situation for a lot of people. I wanted to just give you the opportunity real quick, if you had anything you wanted to plug, any upcoming, books or, events or anything that you've got coming up.
Sure. My book's The Anatomy of Fake News. Gives that history of fake news. It looks at some of the solutions that have been offered and why I disagree with all of them except for education. And then it gives a great sort of like detection kit that folks can use. I'm always publishing news article or journal articles on media literacy and news and all that kind of stuff. And then I'm on Twitter. I'm at Nolan_Higdon, and you can follow my work there as well.
Again, Nolan, thank you so much. Dr. Nolan Higdon, everybody.
Thank you very much.